All right. Good morning, Bridget.
Good morning.
All right. Episode 2 of our podcast experiment. I think today we're going to at least talk kind of loosely about the idea of connection and the importance of that in life. I know we both kind of looked at maybe some past experiments that were done, and we'll be, I guess, maybe loosely talking about those. I suppose it should be said that we're definitely not experts or have gone into this maybe too far, so it is going to be just kind of a loose interpretation of what we found, and then we'll just kind of see where the discussion goes. That seemed fairly...
pretty accurate for what we're trying to do with this episode.
Okay. So, maybe the place then to start is, because this was kind of where the idea came from. You had brought up something that you had saw at one point that had to do with supposed experiment or research that was done by the King of Sicily, Frederick II. It should be noted that it's probably largely debunked. I mean, the experiment probably never happened, but it really had to do with, like, he basically deprived infants of any human contact to basically see. It was a language experiment, but supposedly some really horrible things happened. Mm-hmm. But like I said, that's kind of where this started.
So at one point in time, there was supposedly this experiment that this King Frederick had done that resulted in the death of infants. And through some of the stuff that I was looking through, that was incorrect. But there was Renee Spitz, who had found that orphan children did not develop fully when they were taken away from their parents. And in that study there, they had found that there was this mortality of the orphans. And that's kind of where we're going with this, is looking at some of the stuff that Harry Harlow had done and Renee Spitz on the study of attachment and early child development.
That Renee Spitz, looking into like the research that was conducted, really it was kind of also very interesting, but yeah, it was pretty significant. I mean, the effect that it had. I was looking at the one, what does it say? The one that I looked at said something about comparing children that had been raised in a prison and an orphanage. The children in a prison were able to be raised by their mothers. The infants in the orphanage were raised by a nurse, but each nurse had like 7 babies under their care, so they really were like pretty much like very limited in their contact. And yeah, what you saw in the difference in the development of those babies was significant. Then also watching a YouTube video that referenced it as well too is almost a little hard to watch.
Mm-hmm. When we talked about this earlier, just the idea that children weren't able to experience or exhibit depression, and that was something that they had discovered through this study, with clear identifying factors of depression in these infants who weren't able to have a healthy bond with their mother or their caretaker.
Yeah, well, that was something, that came from the stuff that I looked at too, is it looked like, kind of prior to this Renee Spitz doing this research, I mean, it talked about like there was kind of through like, the academics of the time, there's this kind of general understanding or belief that like infants didn't experience, like depression. Like it must have been something that was more of like an adult onset, type of disorder or whatever. And this research really kind of highlighted the fact that, well, that just simply isn't true. I'm trying to think of what that word was that...
Are you referring to the anaclitic depression?
Yeah. I thought that was really interesting because, yeah, apparently it's something that happens when a baby is suddenly separated from their mother for more than 3 months. and yeah, can apparently lead to like lose their ability to express themselves through gestures like stop smiling, weight loss, not eating, difficulty sleeping, anxiety. I mean, pretty crazy stuff. But going back to that video that I watched, I mean, you really saw that.
Well, not only just those things, but what they found was after they were deprived for a significant period of time, which I think was the longer than 3 months, not only did they experience those symptoms, but their physical development was also impacted. Some of the stuff that I found was they had stunted development in the height and the weight, and kind of like you said, the motor function, and not being able to express themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really significant. I remember, like, in the video specifically, like, it was, the children were, like, over 8 year old. I can't remember, like, specifically the age, but, one was, kind of just this, kind of fat and happy little baby that was playing and interacting, like, with, his mother and just kind of with the toys in the environment. And then, they showed the other child that was, in the orphanage or whatever, and it literally looked like an infant. I mean, it kind of very listless, didn't have a lot of expression. I mean, it was just the profound difference. I mean, it was significant. I don't think prior to kind of looking at this, I would have really realized how significant not, I guess, having like regular like human contact, how profoundly that would have affected development.
Well, and I think this study was huge moving forward with how children were taken care of in a hospital setting, and kind of what you were saying with the nurses having so many children in their care, like just being stretched thin and not being able to give them more. Mm-hmm. And that was a term that came from that was hospitalism, was just their reaction to prolonged deprivation.
Yeah, I know. I had read that too. That, I mean, especially with this Renee Spitz, I mean, it really changed how, I guess, kind of, hospitals interacted, orphanages ran, and I mean, how they provided care for children. I mean, it was, I guess, was a very significant, kind of turning point, I suppose you could say, which I thought was interesting. But to kind of take this now in a little bit of a, maybe of a little bit different direction too, but it's like, thinking about this, kind of bringing it maybe back into the world of like addiction and stuff like that. I mean, I guess I've had some awareness, or I've talked about with clients, like the impact of like, early childhood experiences and, kind of developmental, things that happen and how that contributes to substance use. But I think, largely as society, I mean, we don't look at that. All we see is the end result and the behavior. It's just like all of a sudden you have this adolescent that is, 14 years old and is acting out, maybe, experimenting with substance use, and then they get labeled like a delinquent or something along those lines. And, all you really see is the behavior. Nobody stops to really ask. It's like, well, why is this person acting this way? What are the things that have maybe contributed to why they've ended up where they've ended up? Again, kind of, going back to, the things that we were reading about, with these, studies and stuff like that. I mean, it's really, like I said, brings into perspective, I mean, just how important these, especially early childhood experiences can have.
Well, I think that there is a lot to learn from it, because, some of those findings was the children that didn't receive healthy, nurturing care end up with being labeled as a delinquent or difficult child, or just having behavior issues. And going into how that changed the way hospitals were run, looking at that further with foster care or with placement, whether it's in, I guess, a jail-like setting, or, things like the Dakota Boys and Girls Ranch, just how things are run, and being able to provide those kids with a safe, structured environment in order to rehabilitate them, if you will. Mm-hmm. Why it's so important that we have human connection that's positive.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting too. I mean, obviously, at least I like to believe. I mean, we've made a lot of gains in our understanding of, substance abuse, mental health. I mean, like these early developmental, factors. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of people that have conducted research over the years on this, but it's still, interesting that, despite the gains that we've made, I mean, we still seem like we fully, kind of grasp, at least, maybe on a societal level, the need to really look at, like, again, those factors that are influencing, choices or influencing behaviors, even into adults. A lot of times I think, that even gets further lost, when you get into, like, if we're working with a 40-year-old, individual that's, been in active addiction since they were 16 years old. I mean, by this point, I mean, the person is seen as criminal, as, just, they're not seen in a very good light.
Right, they're viewed as less than in society.
Yeah, I mean, we never stop to think about, how significant, those, things that happen maybe for them throughout their developmental years have impacted, their current behavior. We just want to, like, label the person for who they are. I think that's something that is so, that really holds us back from really being able to make progress in our ability to, I suppose you could say, treat or to help people that are suffering from this. I mean, you think about some of these kids, I mean, I know a lot of them, unfortunately, which is crazy, died from, just the lack of just basic touch. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's crazy to think about, but, as these kids survive or whatever, I mean, it's crazy to think about just how impacted they are. So kind of another piece to this, which you were, I think, just kind of thinking about, was the idea of, like, early childhood experiences, maybe specifically relating back to maybe, like, either, like, the work that maybe, like, Freud did, or even, like...
Carl Jung. Like, why I feel so strongly about this is, the idea that early experiences, predict our future behavior. And kind of going back into what we talked about last week with the self-esteem and looking at the studies that were done by Spitz and Harlow.
I should stop you really quick because we referenced Harlow a couple of times through this, but we should probably just offer a real quick kind of, I suppose, explanation as far as, like, where he comes into play with this.
Right, I think it was, they had titled it The Strange Experiment.
Yeah.
Where he had taken these monkeys and separated them from their mother right away, I believe, at birth, and had two different, I guess, caregiver figures, the one being the wire mother and the other being the cloth mother. I can let you cover that a little bit with what you came up with.
Yeah, well, we'll add a whole lot more, so I mean, we get too far away from what you were wanting to talk about. But it was interesting because Harlow started off with... there were, like, isolation studies where, I mean, he removed, like, they were rhesus monkeys, but removed infant monkeys from their mother. And what he found is, like, apparently they wore, like, cloth diapers. And what he found is in the absence of their mother, they would, like, cling to these, like, cloth diapers, like they're, looking for some sort of, like, soothing type of, I suppose, behavior or something along those lines. And that's then where he led into this, where he spent, a lot of time researching then what happens with these surrogates, like, whether it be, like I said, the surrogate mother is basically was made out of wire or wood, or another one that was kind of made out of foam rubber and terry cloth or whatever. And, even in situations where, like, the wire and wood surrogate mother was the one who, they would essentially, like, rig it with a bottle or whatever and would provide food. They always found that the babies were always gravitating and connecting more with the soft mother, which really is interesting. And I think, kind of the point of that was just looking at how we, seek out that kind of connection with something that's warm and caring, and there's just, you know, a level of safety and security that comes from having, you know, something that we perceive as like, you know, soft and soothing, much like, you know, their real mothers.
Yeah, because I believe the idea with that was we would automatically seek out food, and they had found that it was more comfort.
But anyways, like I said, I don't want to distract too much from kind of what you were talking about, where you're going. I just, like I said, I know we had referenced this Harlow on a few occasions. I just wanted to give a little bit of an kind of an overview of kind of what it was that we had looked at in regards to his work. So anyways, I think you were talking about just like
Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, and their theory about the impact of early experiences.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting too, like with Jung specifically, which is something that I find fascinating, but also like really important to. I mean, I'll talk about that in group with clients. I mean, I can tell you it's something I guess I've honestly worked on individually, but you know, Jung talks a lot about like integration of shadow self, mm-hmm. and I think that ties in well a lot with what we're talking about, because it's like if I have, you know, repressed childhood trauma or experiences or things that are sitting in my unconscious that I have no awareness of, you know, but are obviously affecting my outward behavior, it would make sense then if I'm going to be able to move forward with my life, or if I'm going to find, you know, some sense of like, you know, recovery or like growth, that I would have to figure out some way how to pull those things out of, you know, kind of that land of kind of unconsciousness into, you know, more conscious awareness, so I can actually do something with it. And I think that's, I mean, that maybe is a little bit different, you know, when we're talking about connection, but I think that it's maybe still an important piece to this, though, is it's just like, you know, we have all of these things just bubbling around, you know, inside of us that, you know, we're not even aware are influencing our choices and our behaviors. You know, we never think about, like, you know, maybe if my parents separated when I was 5 years old, or my mom died when I was 6, or, you know, who knows what. But how that then fast forward, you know, like, you know, into adulthood, you know, why you have issues with, like, you know, trust or developing intimate relationships or whatever. I mean, you know, how much those things impact us and prevent us from having connection with people.
Well, I think it has a lot to do with it, like when you're talking about the shadow self and essentially the parts of us that we want to hide from the world, whether it's because like, we're ashamed or whatever the reason might be. When you talk about repressing things or even suppressing things, mm-hmm. something that comes to mind is the phrase, our secrets keep us sick. And going back into early experiences, there was the argument that our early experiences don't affect us with our development and where we're at today. But these studies on connection, these studies on the need for human contact demonstrate that we're human, we're pleasure-driven animals, and we need that. And when there's an absence of that, that's where we have these issues. Mm-hmm. And why it's so necessary to explore that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you go back to, you know, that research specifically by Spitz. What was that term again?
Anaclitic
depression. I mean, that's crazy to think. I mean, like, this is probably, you know, at least some of what he observed is probably happening in babies that are under a year old. I mean, you think about like separation or experiencing depression at infancy. I mean, my God, you know, I mean, like you said, you think about just how that could have a profound effect over the course of your life, and then, you know, not even having an awareness in a sense that you know had even happened. You know, I was listening to an audiobook fairly recently, and they were, you know, talking about the idea that, you know, in a sense, there's no such thing as free will, which, you know, anybody listening, or maybe even yourself, Bridget, I mean, you know, really really have a pretty like strong reaction to that, because it's like, well, of course we have free will. I mean, that's part of being human, but
do we?
But exactly. I mean, when you think about all of these, past experiences, I mean, the book said something about, our present behavior is influenced by the things that happened 1 minute ago, 1 day ago, 1 month ago, 1 year ago, 20 years ago. It's all led to, in a sense, of, being very predictable what our behaviors are going to be. One thing I do want to say is, it's like, it can be easier. Well, it's like, well, if we don't have free will, then how do we change? But I think that's where change occurs, is by really realizing that, in a sense, we don't have free will or free choice, or understanding that our behaviors and our actions, our thoughts, are all influenced by the things that have happened previously in our lives. I think that's where we then regain the ability to do something different. It's just by having that level of awareness of, what, I've just lived my life unconsciously. I mean, gets into a little bit almost, I think, what they're getting at in the AA world when they start talking about powerlessness, is an awareness of, I've just been living my life unconsciously.
Well, I think that we do have free will, not so much in the sense of being able to control what's happening in the brain, but we have the free will to decide whether or not we're going to act on that.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I think that's absolutely true, or at least that's what the hope is. I was actually talking about this with the day treatment group yesterday about, there's a, God, who came up with that? My mind's not working, but he basically said between the space in between like stimulus and response, or like if you wanted to say like a trigger and your behavior, that space in between is the ability then where we are able to have choice. And I think that's what we need to kind of bring into an awareness if we are going to change. I mean, or another way of saying this, simply put, is it's kind of like, I use the equation like I over E, intellect over emotion, thinking before we act. Because a lot of time in active addiction, and I think, even people non-addicted, but maybe, are finding, maybe, why do I kind of always act this way, or why do these things keep happening? It's because, again, I'm just reacting impulsively, in a sense, to emotion. I'm not actually stopping to think about, wait a second, before I react, let me stop, put the brakes on, let me kind of think about this and really think, is this maybe the best way to respond, or is there something that I need to do differently here so that I maybe don't end up in trouble, or I don't end up, making a decision that could really have some pretty negative consequences.
I'm kind of, I guess, piggybacking off the free will and what you're saying with what are the decisions that we're going to make, tying this back into the connection. We've covered Spitz, we've covered a little bit of Harlow, Jung, and Freud, but there was another experiment that was conducted, and that was by a group of psychologists. I don't know if I'll say his name right, but Muzaffer and his wife, I can't remember her name.
Is this that
the Robbers Cave experiment, where what they had done was they took, I think, 22 11-year-old boys and had taken them out and put them in two different groups in two different cabins, and what they were trying to find was this divide, and if it would happen naturally between them. And so they had different activities set up where it was basically competitive for resources, and what they had found was the two groups of boys were not getting along, and that it was just becoming volatile. And then what they wanted to see was whether or not they could turn that around, and they found that through teamwork and working together that the boys were able to get along. And they made a point at the end of the study that the boys decided to ride back on the bus all together. So when we're talking about early life experiences and the trauma or the damage, the negative impact that can be done from deprivation, there is the hope to be able to turn that around.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're talking about addiction, free will, the human connection, yes, we're able to make our own decisions and we might feel like we're in charge, but there's also the impact of who we surround ourselves with.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of goes into being able to form healthy relationships. If you're surrounding yourself with unhealthy people, whether you believe it or not, you're influenced by that mindset and you're more likely to make poor decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people struggle with that in early recovery or with, life changes in general. If you don't make changes to move towards something positive, it's going to be very difficult to believe that within yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And being consistent with that.
Absolutely. Well, that kind of makes me, I hadn't really, thought about this kind of coming into this, but it kind of makes me think about, is the Sanford prison experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting because, these were just like college kids that were essentially, brought, that were, basically agreed to participate in the study or whatever, and were assigned like various roles from like prisoner to, like warden or like, just jailers or whatever. And it's significant. Like, it's crazy. Like, they had to end the experiment early because like they just like became these roles. To the point where it was unhealthy. Like, the jailers in a sense were like abusing the inmates. It was just, it got crazy. And I guess what made me think about that, like with what you're saying, is it's just like, also like thinking like how we can like conform to roles or whatever, without questioning them. Maybe it's whether it's like in a peer group that we're in, or like the what you call it, the Robbers Cave.
The Robbers Cave experiment.
Like with that, it's like just putting individuals into two separate groups and setting expectations, and then having accountability to like living up to your individual role within, I suppose you could say, that group. And then, like I said, you see then how that can really, I guess, have a positive or negative impact. We've been, kind of maybe the studies we've been talking about were more focused on kind of the negative effects on behavior. But I think that, the opposite is true too. It's like, if we're around an appropriate peer group, or if we're in a situation where we can see that appropriate behaviors are modeled or whatever, I think that goes a long way to being able to help us to change.
When talking about connection with others and whether or not those relationships are healthy or unhealthy, speaking on addiction specifically, if you're someone that has struggled or is struggling with that, looking at where did that change for you, and acknowledging the impact of others. Because I think even for myself, losing connection with healthy people, it's like looking back when I started using, the friend groups that changed, the way that I interacted with, my parents or even like, my siblings. I stopped doing that because they weren't using or they weren't engaging in the behaviors that were negative, and that friend group changed into people who would validate those kind of things.
Mm-hmm. Well, I talked about that like in our first video. A big thing for me was, not seeing anything wrong with what I was doing. It was like everybody around me was doing the same thing. So it's like, well, if everybody's doing, the same things, how is what I'm doing wrong? And that really, I would say for at least for a long time, was something that was really, I think, prevented me from really being able to have a level of awareness of the need to change my behavior, because I was just the same as anybody else. Well, that's kind of funny. When I was working with kids in Grand Forks, you do an eval, and it seemed like almost every I mean, you hear this so often from the kids or whatever. They'd be like, "Well, you think I'm bad? You should see my friend." You know, it was just like there was just always this level of like, "Oh, I'm just part of a peer group. I'm not doing anything worse than anybody else." But they didn't see. Well, I think that's one of like it's maybe changed a little bit in the DSM-5, but like one of the criteria for like diagnosing is like changing a peer group. Like you go and changing activities. Like you go from maybe playing basketball or being a wrestler and being a part of that group or whatever, getting good grades in school and having non-using friends, to as you develop, or as your substance abuse, progresses or whatever and starts moving into the world of dependency, we start seeing that, well, I'm not wrestling or I'm not playing basketball anymore. The non-using friends have kind of gone away. School's really become not so much of a priority. I went from maybe A's and B's to now I maybe even have dropped out, and yeah, all of then the world around you matches your behavior. And I mean, I think that, there's several, reasons for that, because it's like we have to be in those groups because we don't want to draw attention to our behavior, because then it would, we'd have to confront the idea that we're abnormal. But it's kind of the same thing. It's just like when, all of those negative behaviors are essentially kind of modeled within that. It's like, well, yeah, I'm fine. I'm not any worse or better than anybody else. I'm just living my life.
Well, when you look at the development over it and the progression over time, we have the loss of connection, which sometimes results in isolation. I hear a lot of people say, I don't need anybody. I can do this by myself. But going into, again, early life experiences, nurturing, and as we go through life, we have needs. You can say, I want a double cheeseburger, or I need food. It's the same thing with emotions. There's a video that I show in my group, and it's a longer one. Some people enjoy it, some people don't. But a really extreme example that they give in there, they're talking about inmates and the needs that need to be met. And one of the things that the speaker says is, he asks, have you ever seen a man in prison with a life sentence who is not getting his needs met? And what he's referring to in that is the sexual needs. And it just really drives home the fact that we need connection. And I don't feel there's a way that we can deny that. Looking at NA or AA, a lot of people don't like that because of what they hear. That's fine. But if you go and you continue going and you develop relationships, you can't deny the feelings that you're having inside from just simply the fellowship. Mm. And what is that? That's connection to others. Mm. And on top of that, it's healthy connections.
Yep. Well, and I think, I'm trying to, remember, I mean, I think you go back to, the early days of AA and NA. You look at like some of the interviews and stuff that like Bill Wilson gave or whatever. I think he kind of talked about that, where it was just this, for him in a sense, it was almost like he didn't even really, understand why it even worked, or he didn't even really care why it worked. But it was this idea of like, we get, find recovery together. I mean, and you see that, I don't, the 12 steps are written in very specific language, and you see that like the first step, the first word is we. And to me, I've always thought that was so significant, because he's laying out the whole idea for what he sees needs to happen for recovery. Is it's like individually, you're not going to make it. You've tried doing this on your own. You've been isolated. You've been withdrawn. You've tried, again, you've just tried doing this on your own and it hasn't worked. The only way that this gets better is by finding a group of people that have gone through similar experiences, that together you can find the strength to recover.
Well, there's just, through these studies and the research done, there's just ongoing evidence that we need others. We're not meant to be alone. We were talking about this the other day, just kind of like a silly example, and I was telling you how there was a video on the scientific, development of what dinosaurs sounded like in the very beginning, because what you have on like Jurassic Park, that's not real. And I mean, I think everybody might experience this, but I know for me, when I heard it, knowing and seeing that it's just through the phone, and that it's not actually happening, there's still that feeling inside. And I think what I was saying on that was just how, when it comes to DNA, like what is developed, I talked about birds and passing down to their offspring, this place is not safe because something happened here, and the birds just know that, and how crazy that is that it can happen that way. And the same thing for humans. So using that example of just the fear that and the tightening in the chest from hearing a dinosaur, it's like going back to, we need connection with others, we need warmth, physical touch, we need affection.
Well, yeah, another thing that comes to mind too, I mean, I think that was probably like, I don't know, 50s, 60s maybe, but there was a lot of studies that were being done with like rats, and it was, you learned about this like in your intro to psych class or whatever, where it was like they would put these rats into a box or a cage or whatever, and basically like let them like self-medicate or self-administer, usually like cocaine or like heroin, opiates of some sorts, and what they would find is like the rats would do that till they died, essentially. And there was a guy that, I think that was in the 70s, developed what was called this idea of Rat Park. And basically created this environment where he put like multiple rats in this cage, gave them tons of stuff to play with. They can interact with each other, and still gave them access to like the same the ability to self-administer drugs, whatever it was, heroin, opiates, or whatever. And what they found was like the rats basically had nothing to do with it. I mean, they very rarely went to that water or whatever. And the idea was that, where it was just like, when we're in healthy environments and around healthy people, we have positive connection where, how significantly, that changes things. Like I said, it's just, there's that need for warmth and connection, touch, play, positive interaction. It all, without it, we're not designed that way, I guess, is my belief. We need positive human interaction. If we're isolated and alone, we're not going to be successful.
Yeah, they essentially created this paradise for rats, and I think that's what we need to ask ourselves, is what is our paradise? How do we thrive?
Yeah, it's, I can look at that, in my own life, it's like, I mean, not only am I successful because of having the right people around me, having, the right family, the right parents, that, modeled appropriate behaviors and all those other things to me. It's having that support network. It's, a recognition of the importance of that, and it's like, I can honestly say, I mean, as I've been able to maybe develop better and healthier relationships, I can see how much more successful my life has been. I mean, I go back to, I would say pre-25 years old. I mean, I suppose you could say I had friends and stuff like that, but, with just my own anxiety and my own, like, the low self-esteem and all those other things, and, a lot of maybe those relationships or the person that I was portraying being superficial or whatever, I mean, I can see why I wasn't very successful, because I was alone. I wouldn't let anybody really in. I didn't really have, I suppose, a lot of trust. I was always, I was just isolated and alone, and I can really see since that time through the present, I mean, how profoundly my life has changed in very positive ways. I mean, I don't have no doubt I would be here in this position having this conversation with you if that hadn't happened.
Well, I think part of that for me is just the validation of emotions. And that kind of goes into relationships. And I think that's something that we could cover on its own another time, but just having healthy people, and it's a mutual exchange of warmth, love, affection, and not even just, you know, on a romantic level, but a platonic level or a family level, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so...
Well, that might be an alright place to stop. Was there anything else that you wanted to cover for today?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that we've talked a lot about, you know, what we went over on our own and what we were trying to cover today. I think we've really driven home this idea of connection.
The one thing that really, I'll just say surprised. Well, when I kind of had started this, and you had kind of, you know, said, you know, that talking about connection was maybe, you know, a good idea for today or whatever. I honestly didn't really expect to kind of do the deep dive into, especially, I suppose you could say, like, you know, early childhood development, you know, that I ended up. But, because, yeah, I mean, some of this I had an awareness, just, you know, like, working with the population of people we do, but I was really amazed, you know, when you started looking at these studies, like, how significant, you know, that connection, and from a very early childhood. I mean, to the point where it could kill you. I mean, to think that just by not having, like, even just like touch, basic nurturing, you know, having, you know, trust in a caregiver, it can literally, like, kill you. I mean, it was really surprising. I mean, as we got into some of this, just looking at the significance of connection, and, you know, just having, you know, that person that you could go to.
Well, and I think what, you know, people who are watching this, and, you know, our episodes moving forward will learn about me, is that I'm very passionate, and I feel very strongly about this kind of stuff. The whole idea that we need others, that we have emotions, because I fought it for so long. And I feel like if I can understand that, then I want to help other people understand that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, there's definitely, you know, a balance. I mean, you're successful, I mean, yes, largely because of the choices you made, and, you know, your willingness to change, to do the hard work. But there is an aspect, I would say, too, where, or at least a balance with that, you know, there's also been help along the way, that if you wouldn't have sought that out, or if you wouldn't have received that, it either would have taken you a lot longer to get here, or you know, maybe wouldn't have been as successful.
No, I think I would have abandoned ship. You know, I was that person who said, I don't need help from others. I don't need to have all these people in my life, that I can do this on my own. And it was learning and being okay with accepting help from others, understanding that it's okay, and it's just the right decision to have people in your corner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Well, like you said, I think that's a good place to stop. So this will be the conclusion of episode 2, and we'll see what next time brings.
Well, hopefully you guys have a good weekend, and we'll be back next week.
Absolutely.